Turkey wheat down.
Swiss on white.
Cucumber rye, Russian.
Come again.
Cucumber rye, Russian.
Ham on rye.
Chocolate malt.
80 watt.
Bacon Swift, BT down.
Less than 1 up.
Burn one.
Here in the USA, we composers have no possibility of directing the musical affairs of the nation. On the contrary, I have the impression that more and more we are working in a vacuum.
Attempting to counteract that vacuum, Copland became a political actor, and he migrates to the far left. He even, in 1934, addressed a communist picnic in Minnesota.
If they were a strange sight to me, I was no less of one to them. It was the first time that many of them had seen an intellectual. I was being gradually drawn, you see, into the political struggle with the peasantry. I wish you could have seen them, the true third estate, the very material that makes revolution. It's one thing to think revolution or talk about it to one's friends, but to preach it from the streets out loud. Well, I made my speech and I'll probably never be the same. Now, when we go to town, there are friendly nods from sympathizers, and farmers come up and talk as one red to another. I'll be sorry to leave here with the thought of probably never seeing them again.
And Copland took part in a contest created by the new masses for the best workers' song. Everybody had to set the same poem into the streets May 1st, and Aaron Copland won with this song.
Into the streets, May 1st, into the roaring square, shake the midtown towers, crash the downtown air. Come with the storm of banners, come with the earthquake dread. Dance, ring out over belfries, red flag, keep up your red.
Will you stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear the testimony you are about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Mr. Copland, you are residing at...
Shady Lane Farm, Ossining, New York.
And you are a musician, composer, and lecturer?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Copland, have you ever been a communist?
No, I have not been a communist in the past, and I am not now a communist.
Have you ever been a communist sympathizer?
I'm not sure that I would be able to say what you mean by the word sympathizer. From my impression of it, I have never thought of myself as a communist sympathizer.
You did not?
I did not.
Did you ever attend any communist meetings?
I never attended any specific communist meeting, function of any kind.
I was fortunate enough to spend some time with Copland. I think he was about 80 years old. I do remember one afternoon I spent with him, the entire afternoon, just the two of us, which happened by accident at Tanglewood. And he was extremely gracious. He was extremely down to earth. He seemed to care about me, and it was definitely a two-way conversation, even though I was in my early 20s. And at the same time, I didn't learn anything about his personal situation.
Hello and good evening. Good afternoon to you. My name is Kirill Gerstein, and you've tuned into Kirill Gerstein Invites, an online seminar. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming Joe Horowitz here, great friend, cultural historian, renowned author, artistic administrator. Joe wears many hats and has written 10 books. His new book is coming out very soon, so this is actually very timely. On November 23, Dvorak's Prophecy and the Vexed Fate of Black Music, Black Classical Music. So Joe will talk about this very relevant subject, and Joe has been busy with this topic for much longer than it's been fashionable. And as always, your questions and comments and participation is vital to this live format. And it's a pleasure to welcome you here. I'm at the Danish radio in their beautiful concert hall. So wherever you are, hello and welcome, Joe.
Well, Kirill, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Great to have you. Great to have you. So tell us. I mean, this opening film, or the teaser for the film that you've produced, and I think you've said that there are 6 films associated or connected to the upcoming book that you have produced. So much food for thought already in this first video excerpt. But tell us.
Well, during COVID, I turned myself into a filmmaker, which I had never really envisioned. And these 6 films have just been released on Naxos, and they're all linked to my book in various ways. And we'll see excerpts from 3 of them. This is the trailer for the Copland film, which touches a lot of bases. They're all films which treat topics in American music in the larger framework of the American experience. And in case of Copland, you have a virtual parable of an American artist, a prominent American artist, who courts America and then is rebuffed by America. And you could read it in many ways. I think in some ways it's a parable about the fate of the American artist. Never more so than today, I feel as if the arts are being erased from the American experience. So that's one way to look at this film and one way to look at Copland. Another way is, as I suggest in the film, to see him as a cork in a stream, which is to say, an artist buffeted by the storm winds of American social and political currents. And ultimately, I say something about Copland that not everybody will agree with, which is that while his turn to populism and his eagerness to embrace social causes and political causes was a very wonderful and honorable response to the Depression, I think at heart he was a modernist, and that his best music precedes that. I'm thinking especially of the piano variations. Do you know that? Do you play the piano variations, Kirill?
No, I don't play the piano variations, but of course I know the piece.
And so I see him as somebody who's insufficiently anchored. And I juxtapose him in my book with the 2 great talents in the history of American classical music, Charles Ives and George Gershwin. And in the context of that comparison, the larger theme of the book is to take issue with the standard narrative for American classical music, which was authored by Copland and Virgil Thomson and later embraced by Leonard Bernstein. And they all felt that American composers had no usable past, had no forebears on which to build, nothing really before 1910. And we've got to replace that as quickly as we can, because we now know about Charles Ives, who's a towering figure, who is a forebear, who does connect us. This stranded world of American classical music, increasingly shrunken and stranded. Ives connects us with Whitman. Ives connects us with Melville. Ives connects us with the Transcendentalists. So this is a large and crippling failure of American classical music, its failure to identify a usable past. And a symptom of it right now is the panic to perform Black classical music because it was never acknowledged or discovered. There's every reason we should be performing the music of Black composers. There's every reason we should have been performing that music for some time, just as we've neglected the music of Ives or Chadwick or Lou Harrison or Bernard Herrmann. There's a long list of composers who fall outside this standard narrative to which we've been overly attentive for a long time.
But to give us context and to rewind a little bit in the title of your book with Dvorak's prophecy. So how in your view of the narrative as a cultural historian, as writer, how does Dvorak become this initial prophet?
So let's talk a little about the history of Dvorak's sojourn and its reputation. Here's a guy in America, 1892 to 1895, who was really famous, really controversial, really influential in the United States those 3 years. Everybody knew he said two things. One is that the so-called Negro melodies would foster a great and noble American music, by which he meant an American classical music. And he also embraced Native America. He viewed Native Americans and African Americans as iconic or representative Americans. And as I say, that was influential and controversial. And he was a catalyst, not least for Black classical music, beginning with his assistant, Harry Burleigh, a young Black man from Erie, Pennsylvania. After Dvorak died, it was Burleigh who played the pivotal role in turning spirituals into concert songs. So if you've ever heard Marian Anderson or Paul Robeson sing Deep River, that's Burleigh's Deep River. And then after Burleigh, who is himself forgotten, come even more forgotten Black composers, the most important of which are William Dawson, Florence Price, William Grant Still, and Nathaniel Dett, which are suddenly being discovered. And if we are to contextualize this rediscovery, we have to do so in the context of Du Bois and Dvorak. Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, a great, great figure in American history, is also the author of the same prophecy in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, a decade after Dvorak's prophecy. So if I can retain my train of thought, yes, you have Dvorak as a key figure. When the standard narrative kicks in, Kirill, the story of Dvorak is forgotten. And the authors of the standard narrative are not interested in Dvorak, are not interested in his New World Symphony. Virgil Thomson called it hackneyed. Leonard Bernstein made fun of it. And Dvorak does not figure in the first important histories of American classical music, whether they're written by composers like Copland and Thompson or written by music historians like Gilbert Chase. It's only recently, and it's very incompletely, that historians of American music have gone back to Dvorak and realized that he mattered then and he matters now.
And do you think, I'm sure you'll give us reasons for why Dvorak did not become a part of the standard narrative?
Well, we can jump right now to the music that I've been badgering you about for years. Everybody knows the New World Symphony, 1893. It's not well known the degree to which it's saturated with the Song of Hiawatha. A music historian, Mike Beckerman, only beginning in the 60s and 70s, made us aware of how much of Longfellow was composed into the New World Symphony, in addition to African American sources. But after that, and now we're talking about stuff that's even less well known, Dvorak's American style evolved. And in 1894, he was composing music that doesn't even sound like Dvorak. And I would liken him to Scarlatti in Spain. Or Kurt Weill in New York. He became an American composer as of 1894. Then he dropped his American style when he went back to Prague. So what are the fruits of his 1894 American style? First of all, there's the American Suite, which we don't know. which he composes both in a solo piano version and an orchestral version, which comprises a series of snapshots, even like postcards of America. And amazingly, there are these two humoresques, the G-flat humoresque, which we know, but most people don't realize it's by Dvorak, very bluesy, and in a humoresque in F, to which I believe I introduced you, the beginning of which absolutely sounds like it was composed by George Gershwin, which is to say, it could have been embedded in Porgy and Bess 40 years later. So you asked me, why don't we know these pieces? In the case of these pieces, it's because the Dvorak literature, the scholarly literature, is largely written by British music historians and Czech music historians who literally don't hear the American accent in the American suite. And if you don't, it just becomes banal. If you're American, however, I would say it's completely unignorable. You can hear the minstrel dance, the plantation song, the evocation of the American West, of the elegiac Native American. So that's a specific answer to your question. Why don't we know these pieces Dvorak composed in 1894?
But also what you're saying is that he did not, for Virgil Thomson, for Leonard Bernstein, for Aaron Copland, he did not become part of their constructed narrative of where classical music in America came from and where it was going.
He was not aesthetically kindred. He's a roots in the soil romantic. These guys are modernists, and it's part of the modernist credo that they're a first cause, that they're originators, they're inventors. I don't begrudge them that, but their influence is what's problematic. And when you're talking about Black classical music in the 30s and the 40s, it's absolutely kindred to Dvorak. It's romantic, roots in the soil, nationalistic music. It's not modernist. It does not resonate with the music of Thompson. It doesn't resonate with Roy Harris. It doesn't resonate with Aaron Copland. It resonates with the New World Symphony. And later in this conversation, we'll sample what seems to me the biggest buried treasure, which is the William Levy Dawson Negro Folk Symphony, which Stokowski premiered in 1934. And without any special pleading, you can claim this as a major American symphonic work.
Yet not very well known at all.
Even today, when we're racing to perform symphonic music by Black composers, we're very sluggishly coming to this piece. Roderick Cox did it in Hamburg for Thomas Hampson. James Conlon did it in Aspen. Did he do it in Aspen? I think so. He did it recently in Baltimore. He's doing it in Cincinnati. We are Post-Classical Ensemble, the orchestra I co-founded in DC 20 years ago with a wonderful Spanish-born conductor, Angel Ordóñez. We'll be doing it in March. Naxos recently released a recording, but the big orchestras have still not gotten around to it, and they will, they must, and sooner or later it will become canonized. It's too good to ignore.
So should we show this little clip with the humoresque, so some more people will be?
Yes. So the Dvorak pieces that I'm yakking about, they're on a CD which I produced called Dvorak in America, and they're in this film. This is the film called The Souls of Black Folk, and we'll be hearing performances by Benjamin Pasternak, who we already heard from. That was the guy who was talking about Copland, who has a magnificent recording of the Copland Piano Fantasy, a piece we could talk about, which we were hearing in the background. But this clip is from It's little known that subsequent to composing the New World Symphony, Dvorak composed other American works in an evolving American style. This is now 1894, the year of the G-flat humoresque, a tune many people know without realizing it was composed by a Bohemian. Listen to how bluesy are the cadences in this piano piece composed by Antonin Dvorak. In 1894 as well, Dvorak composed a very little known F major humoresque with a theme so blue, it might have been composed by George Gershwin when he wrote Porgy and Bess 4 decades later. And this tune is even bluesier when it comes back with another cadence.
So bluesy indeed. He influences some of the students in the direction in which things go, and then what happens? He goes back to Prague.
Dvorak is a guy he's quoted in New York saying, a composer must prick his ear to every sound that he encounters. He's helplessly susceptible to the sounds around him. So there's no way he can retain his American style when he's back in Prague. And it was inevitable that he would compose a New World Symphony, just as inevitable as that Gustav Mahler, who a few years later turns up in New York, would not compose a New World Symphony because Mahler lived in his head. Dvorak did not. His ear was always pricked.
And then what happens? What I mean is, but what's happening in America then? If I'm trying to sort of follow your narrative, so
sure, there's an underground narrative and an above ground narrative. The underground narrative is Dvorak has a coterie, and it includes William Arms Fisher, and it includes Harry Burleigh, it includes Reuben Goldstein. Who are these people? What do they do? Burleigh, I already referenced. After Dvorak died, he's a big guy. He's the guy who turns the spirituals into art songs. And he has himself some extraordinary art songs, especially a setting of Langston Hughes in 1935. Burleigh is a composer we still have not sufficiently honored. William Arms Fisher is the guy who turns the Largo of the New World Symphony into Goin' Home. We would not have Goin' Home without William Arms Fisher. He's a Dvorak student. He did that because of his schooling with Dvorak. He also published Samuel Coleridge Taylor's Negro Melodies in 1905, and Coleridge Taylor, we're talking about a famous Black British composer who comes to the US. Everybody's telling him, do it. do what Dvorak said. Burley's telling him. Coleridge-Taylor does it, but he can't do it as well as Burley does it. But it's part of the same story. Coleridge-Taylor, part of the same story. Burley, William Arms Fisher, Reuben, is it Goldstein, Goldberg?
Goldmark, somebody.
Goldmark, thank you. Okay, so Goldmark, his students include Copland, Gershwin. He has himself pieces that are sort of, Negro Rhapsody type pieces that are played for a time. And then the Black composers kick in. So I'm telling you a story, as I said, that goes underground, that we're now excavating for the first time. And once it becomes invisible, what you have are these modernists on top of it who believe they have no usable roots. And we have important American music, which we do know from the 30s and the 40s, which bears no relationship to this underground lineage that we're now taking, spades and shovels to uncover, to unearth, to perform. So you've got two different streams, one above ground and one below ground.
So, and two questions there immediately. So, A, where does George Gershwin sit? And obviously, you have much to say about George Gershwin. And then also, what are some of the reasons why you think the modernist movement, aside of being modernist, sort of ignores the time and the place where they are? If you would theorize, but let's possibly first discuss. So, where does
George Gershwin? George Gershwin. So I call this the new paradigm, my new narrative, and the two heroes in my new paradigm are Ives and Gershwin, and there I argue in my book more kindred than you might think. Gershwin tried to meet with Ives. He admired Ives' music, but what makes them profoundly kindred is their relationship to the vernacular. Just like the Dvorak, they're devoted to the vernacular, whether it's parlor songs, Civil War songs, Tin Pan Alley, jazz. They do not have an arm's length relationship to the vernacular. They feast on the vernacular. Gershwin was the great hope of American classical music. Had he not died before the age of 40, he was of the same generation, excuse me, as Aaron Copland. He could have lived to 1980. It would have changed the course of American music because he was the mediator between the popular genres and classical music. This schism which afflicts classical music or music in America is one that he addressed and might have healed, at least to some degree. So I'm talking to you, Kirill, as somebody who's a distinguished exponent of the music of George Gershwin, who studied and pursues jazz piano, who improvises when he performs the Concerto in F, and whose CD, The Gershwin Moment, includes a note by myself called The Gershwin Moment. And I coined this phrase, the Gershwin moment, in juxtaposition to another phrase, the Gershwin threat. So as briefly as possible, when I wrote my book, Classical Music in America, published in 1905, one of my biggest discoveries was that Gershwin did not have advocates among American-born American composers. All the guys who stood up for Gershwin as a composer of consequential concert music in the United States were foreign-born. Fritz Reiner, Otto Klemperer, Charles Morton Leffler, and Arnold Schoenberg. He's the guy who got it right. He said, "You're two great composers." Great composers. He used those terms, that term. Charles Ives and George Gershwin. Amen, I agree. But you don't find any American-born composer of Gershwin's generation looking at Gershwin and saying there's a great composer. I omitted Heifetz as another one of these foreign-born classical musicians. Heifetz wanted a violin concerto from Gershwin. He very, very superbly created these cameos out of Porgy and Bess for violin and piano. And those are some of his best recordings, in my opinion. So Gershwin And I regard Porgy and Bess as the highest creative achievement in American classical music. It's been reviled, misunderstood. I have an entire book about Porgy and Bess called On My Way. So one cannot say enough about Gershwin. What would you like to say about Gershwin?
No, I'm here to listen to you. But what I've learned from you, and what was indeed shocking, are, for example, the dates of the subscription debuts of pieces like the Concerto in F on a program of a major American orchestra, or or Porgy and Bess at the Met, its first staging, etc. And perhaps you can share those, because I think it's rather I found it rather.
Page 110. I'll just read some of this very, very long footnote. Not until 2000 did Daniel Barenboim become the first Chicago music director to lead the Concerto, Rhapsody in Blue, and An American in Paris on regular season subscription concerts. In other words, these three pieces, to make a long story short, when I was writing this book in 2005, I contacted more than a dozen American orchestras and asked them three questions. When did you first perform the Concerto in F on subscription? When did you first perform Rhapsody in Blue on subscription? When did you first perform American in Paris on subscription? In the case of the Chicago Symphony, the answer was 2000. The Boston Symphony first gave these works on subscription in 2005, that's the Concerto, 1997, Rhapsody in Blue, and 2005, that's American in Paris. And then the exception that proves the rule, amazingly, the New York Philharmonic always, all the time, doing Gershwin on regular subscription concerts. And here are the New York Philharmonic conductors, music directors, who performed Gershwin on regular subscription concerts. Radzinski, Metropolis, Bernstein, Maida, Mazur, Mazel, Alan Gilbert. They all did it, but that was unique to New York. So this is a big story to absorb. He was sidelined as a pops composer, and he was patronized and diminished as a kind of gifted dilettante, the very label that was stuck on Charles Ives as well.
And speaking about Ives for a second, but speaking about the vernacular and this division between the classical and the pops programming, talk about that more. I know you have very strong opinions about.
Well, I wouldn't make that division at all. It's the same schism that I referenced before. Here you have Dvorak's prophecy, which is prescient, prophetic, humanitarian, and it's fulfilled. Ragtime, jazz, the blues, rap, all of these Black genres are fulfillment of Dvorak's prophecy. And it, I believe, could have been fulfilled in classical music as well. Just look at Porgy and Bess or the Dawson Symphony, which we'll be talking about in a moment. But that resource, the Black musical motherlode, was squandered, I believe, for the most part, by American concert composers. I think I've lost track of your question, Kirill. Did I answer?
No, you didn't. This is very fitting. So I'm trying to follow this line of so why this schism arose and why it was so persistent, or has been so persistent until.
Thank you. Well, the schism, of course, is not unique to America, but believe me, it's far more pronounced here. If you just look at the response to jazz, look at what Bartók or Stravinsky or Honegger, Mio, any of those guys are saying. They even come here and lecture American composers and tell them, you're not paying enough attention to jazz. So why is there a jazz threat? Another term I use, as there is a Gershwin threat. And the Gershwin threat is sort of a subset of the jazz threat. One has to say, in part, it's a symptom of provincialism, that Americans were eager to pedigree their nascent classical music enterprise. And for a pedigree, they looked to Beethoven. They didn't look to Dvorak or Dawson or Gershwin. So I think it's partly that. Jazz was, aesthetically disreputable, morally disreputable. So Americans attempting to demonstrate that their classical music culture was international caliber were mainly looking towards performers and orchestras. Their proud achievement was, say, the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Boston Symphony, the New York Philharmonic. The composers, as Copland often wrote, were thrust in the back seat. There's another factor, which is the immigration of major composers from Europe, which I write about in another book of mine called Artists in Exile. So what's the impact of having Schoenberg, Bartók, Hindemith, Stravinsky living in the United States? It's a very complicated question, and there are many, many answers to it, but certainly it's another factor in all of these developments, these problematic post-World War I developments, which I've long pondered. The basic reality is that, contrary to everyone's expectation before World War I, classical music in America remained Eurocentric. It never did become American. And the proof is the repertoire of any American orchestra or opera company that you look at today. We never established a canon. We don't have it. We didn't have it then, we don't have it now.
And so, what to do now is one of the questions. So you said the reckoning is here, and obviously there's much research and much thrust towards programming in more diverse ways. What's your view on the current situation?
Glaringly self-evident, which is American orchestras have to curate the American past, which they've never done. Just look across the street at an American museum. Look at an art museum, any art museum. There'll be scholars on staff. They curate the American past in visual art. My favorite exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum over the past decade was about Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole was the teacher of Frederick Church. Frederick Church, the founder of the Hudson River School, was for decades the most popular, most influential, most iconic American painter. And the exhibit was about the European influence on Cole by painters like Claude Lorraine. So it was an exemplary exercise in curating the American past. If an orchestra were to undertake a similar exercise, they would be showing the influence of John Knowles Paine symphonies on George Chadwick symphonies. But these symphonies are not known to American orchestras. Paine is the composer of the first symphonies by an American that I would say are really, fulfilled and polished works. They don't sound American, Chadwick's do. But they're certainly works we should know and works we should perform.
But this is anyway generally I find interesting question that you and I have spoken about this curation and programming, and you have pointed me towards what you think is a rather specific moment when you say that in American classical music presenting, things changed from curating to possibly trying to please or appease the public. Can you talk about that?
Well, maybe I was telling you about Arthur Judson.
Yes, I think you were talking about Arthur Judson and Otto Klemper and his potentially being the New York Philharmonic. And I think that's an interesting story to share with.
Okay, let's share that story. This is in my book, Classical Music in America. So if people know the name Arthur Judson, they know he was the major power broker in American classical music after the First World War. He founded Columbia Artists Management, and he ran at one time or another the Philadelphia Orchestra and the New York Philharmonic. And he saw himself as a salesman of music. He used that term. And here's the sort of the emblematic moment. In the 30s, there were complaints about Toscanini's programming with the New York Philharmonic, that it was insufficiently inquisitive, exploratory, too much music we already know. And Judson did something he rarely did, which is he publicly responded. And his public response, which was in the New York Times, explained that the audience sets taste, and we can't go further than the audience permits. So this is a striking moment, because before then, it had always been assumed that the conductor set taste, whether it was Koussevitzky or Stokowski or Theodore Thomas in Chicago. That was something a conductor did, not the audience. And as far as Klemperer is concerned, Otto Klemperer badly wanted to become the music director of the New York Philharmonic in the 30s, after Toscanini left in 36. And he was considered a candidate by Arthur Judson. Klemperer insisted upon performing Mahler's Second Symphony. And that was the kiss of death, because Judson didn't want to hire somebody who was eager to do Mahler symphonies. An even better story is about Metropolis. In the 40s, Metropolis gave the American premiere of Mahler's Sixth Symphony. And Judson decided he would not broadcast this performance. The Philharmonic had nationally broadcast concerts every week. And Judson said, that week, we're going to replace Mahler's Sixth with the Gershwin Piano Concerto performed by Oscar Levant, because we're not going to nationally broadcast Mahler's Sixth. And there's a letter in which Metropolis says, I am begging you on my knees. This is something important. It will bring honor to the New York Philharmonic. It's necessary to nationally broadcast this important unknown symphony by Mahler Sixth. And the broadcast went out with the Gershwin Piano Concerto. Ironically, Oscar Levant, I'm sure, would have supported Metropolis and the Mahler Sixth over, Levant was a student of Schoenberg. So that's the story about Arthur Judson. And there's a detailed account of this in the Klemperer biography by the British music critic, whose name I'm forgetting, but it's a 2-volume biography. And in excruciating detail, it narrates this collision between Otto Klemperer and Arthur Judson.
And you think this is symbolic, or had this profound effect on shifting sort of
Look around. This is the prevalent assumption. You can't go further than the audience would permit. That assumption was never embraced by Stokowski or Metropolis or Koussevitzky. Just, I dwell on Koussevitzky and Stokowski in my book, Classical Music in America, because they're just exemplars of what a music director should do. And when we get to the Dawson Symphony, we're going to be talking about a piece that was not only premiered by Leopold Stokowski, but he put it on a young people's concert. He took it to Carnegie Hall. He broadcast it nationally. And when the score was finally published in the early 60s, he went back to it and recorded it with his American Symphony. That's being a music director. When Koussevitzky gave the premiere of the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, which he commissioned, he thought it was so important that he repeated it, an unscheduled performance on the same season, so that it could be heard again and broadcast. Nobody would do that today.
And I think you just mentioned museums and curation, and somehow if one looks at the situation today, it seems, I often marvel going to an exhibition also of so-called modern art, new art, where museums are full. If the exhibition is well done, if it's interesting, if it's well curated, people stand literally in lines. Whereas that might not necessarily be the case with our music institutions. And why do you think that is? Where's the failure? Is it the failure of the curation? Is that you find that there's not enough courage to curate, or the moment's gone, or all of the above?
I had lunch a few months ago with Jesse Rosen, who is the former head of the League of American Orchestras, and he had just read an advanced copy of my book, Dvorak's Prophecy, and he buys it. So he said to me, if you were addressing the annual conference of the League of American Orchestras, what's the one thing you would tell them? And I said, hire dramaturgs. You're in Europe, Kirill, so you know that opera companies, theater companies, orchestras have dramaturgs. There are no dramaturgs to speak of that I can think of in the American symphonic community. You need a scholar on staff who can help you curate the American past. And then I got home and I realized there's nobody to hire because there's a larger failure, which includes the scholarly community, to investigate classical music in America in the 19th century, including its repertoire. And all of this led to a plan, which may or may not bear fruit, to have an institute at the Brevard Music Festival, which you know and have taken part in this summer. Brevard, and if Jason Posnick is on this webinar, hello, Jason, maybe you'd like to speak, is going to do a festival based on my book. And they have a wonderful artistic administrator, Jason Posnick, who is an intellectual and reads books as well as being a superb violinist. And we're trying to create an institute that would be a catalyst, a first step in figuring out how to train people to be dramaturgs for American orchestras. And there's interest in this at the University of Michigan from Mark Clegg, at the Blair School of Music for Frank Candelaria. So I think it's an artistic deficit and a staffing problem. What orchestras need right now is not just to do more music by Black composers or to hire diversity coordinators or do marketing studies to enhance ticket sales. There's a fundamental structural problem, which is there's nobody there who can curate repertoire in a way that can help orchestras at last become American, become bona fide American cultural institutions. And unless or until that happens, they will become increasingly marginal.
And well, I want to hear more about that initiative. And Jason indeed is here, which is very. But one of the other hats that you've worn is that of a music critic or as a music writer, music journalist for a paper. And do you find that the role of writing about music can help and be different than what it is now, or what's your impression there?
I was a New York Times music critic very, very long time ago. It was a role I didn't enjoy for many reasons. I didn't think I was very good at it. I didn't believe in the concerts that I was reviewing. And I felt cut off from the cultural life that I was ostensibly assessing. The first thing that pops into my mind is that the schism, we talked about schisms before, between the role of a music critic and the musical life of a city or of a nation is not healthy. And if you go back to the heyday of American classical music in the 1890s, when Dvorak was in New York, the big critic there, Henry Crabill, is absolutely crossing the line all the time. But alas, there are no more music critics here in the United States. We have Alex Ross at the New Yorker performing a vital role, and a handful of newspapers that retain music critics. Kirill, what was your question?
My question was whether also from this dramaturgical and curational point of view, whether you find that music journalism and music criticism can help as well, or you find that
it could have when we still had it in the United States. The most proactive and most influential music critic in the history of American musical journalism was Henry Crabill, who figures very largely in my books. Crabill was the critic of the New York Tribune. He was the greatest of all advocates of the New World Symphony. He once said that the proudest moment in his life was being able to visit Dvorak in his apartment full of birds. And Dvorak at a table wrote down for Crabill musical examples from his New World Symphony, which Crabill could then incorporate in his piece, telling people about the New World Symphony prior to its first performance. Crabill had his hands in a lot of stuff. He was a historic advocate for African American spirituals. He was a student of Native American music. He was an important ethnomusicologist before there was a name for it. He was a major figure in the Wagnerism movement. So he's in a moment where these guys there are a lot of them, and they're empowered. Whether it's Honecker or Crabill or Philip Hale in Boston, it's a dynamic moment for American classical music, and a fluid moment, a supple moment, where it's possible to exert influence. And very great influence was exerted by Crabill, by Anton Seidel, by Dvorak, by Theodore Thomas, Henry Higginson. The most colossal figure in the list I just mentioned is Henry Higginson, who invented the Boston Symphony. And by the way, Arthur Nikisch was the conductor there for 4 years and conducted 400 concerts with the Boston Symphony. Crabill hired him before Nikisch was the conductor of the Leipzig Gewandhaus or the Berlin Philharmonic. This unknown tale of classical music in America before 1900 is a stupendous story. New York and Boston were world music capitals before the First World War. And yet we've grown up with the notion that there's no usable past. It drives me crazy.
But absolutely, we can't ignore, and I can't not ask you, and I think it's in the first chapter of your upcoming book, the appropriation debate. And it's obviously something that's very much at the forefront of many discussions now, cultural appropriation. And what is your comment, or what are your defenses on this?
My comment is that all culture is appropriative. I don't have a problem with Gershwin. I don't have a problem with Arthur Farwell. So he's maybe the biggest victim. He's virtually a canceled composer. This is a Naxos CD that's about a week old. Arthur Farwell, America's neglected composer. In my book, I call him America's forbidden composer. And who is he? It's Dvorak all over again. Farwell said he was the first composer to take up Dvorak's challenge. He became the leader of the Indianist movement in American music. He's unperformable today because he's rejected as an appropriator. I must have nagged you at some point, Kirill, about his piano music. He has 2 phenomenal piano pieces, the Navajo War Dance No. 2 and Pawnee Horses. The guy who most championed the Navajo War Dance No. 2, John Kirkpatrick, was the champion of the Concord Sonata by Charles Ives. I'm talking about a very astringent, dissonant piece of music, not at all kitschy. Pawnee Horses, just a magnificent keyboard cameo. Ben Pasternak performs these pieces on the Dvorak in America CD that I referenced before. Emanuele Arciuli, who you may know, is the pianist on this CD. So Farwell is a victim of this notion that it's bad to appropriate. I don't know if Kurt Cacioppo is in the room right now, but Kurt, an important American composer, studied with Leon Kirchner at Harvard. A lot of his music is based on Native America, and he writes about Farwell with enormous authority, more than I could. And he sees Farwell as a heroic figure, as do I, a visionary, an advocate for Native America. And I'm talking about a composer who's excoriated by people who do not know about him and do not know his music. His peak achievement as an Indianist is the Hako String Quartet. The world premiere recording is in that CD I just referenced. If you play in a string quartet and you're an American, you got to do, or at least know, the Hako Quartet by Farwell, the fourth quartet of George Chadwick, and the second quartet of Charles Ives. These are peak compositional achievements by Americans.
But so, what is your reply to those that say, well, he's using culture that isn't his, and this is another case of Eurocentric white imperialism or domination over another culture?
Every composer, every painter who ever lived draws on cultures not his or her own. Kirill, maybe we should you want to go to the Dawson clip so we can hear?
Absolutely, I think it's high time for the Dawson.
It's very long, so just terminate it whenever you want. But what we're going to sample is the middle movement of the Dawson Negro Folk Symphony on this new Naxos recording. It's called Hope in the Night, and it's an arduous journey into the light by a folk held in darkness. I'm just paraphrasing Dawson's own program note for this magnificent American symphony. This is from another one.
When is this written? Just to give context to.
It was premiered by Stokowski in '34. It's hard to date it precisely. He may have finished it a few years before that. Then he revised it much later as a result of a trip to Africa. But you can think of it as a symphony from the 30s that's not modernist. The eventual climax of this movement is punctuated by a clamor of chimes, chains of servitude. Finally, 3 gong strokes that preface the movement. The Trinity, says Dawson, that guides forever the destiny of man, are amplified by a seismic throb of chimes and timpani. That is the end of it. And I got to tell you that every time Stokowski performed this 3 times, the audience, this is at Carnegie Hall and the Philadelphia Academy of Music, burst into applause so sustained that the orchestra had to rise in the middle of the symphony. That actually happened 3 times. And this is Stokowski. I mean, the Stokowski recording, you can easily find it on YouTube. He makes the most out of the ending of this movement. He may even rescore it. It's just mesmerizing.
And Dawson lived till 1990, no?
Yeah, let me just credit Peter Bogdanoff before we go on. My partner in these films is the visual artist Peter Bogdanoff. He's the one who found that photo and scanned it so beautifully. The films are available on DVD. You can buy them by going to if you go to my website, josephhorowitz.com, it's probably the easiest way to find the films. And this film is called The Souls of Black Folk.
And I'll post the address of your site for everyone as well in the chat. We left I've slightly, but there's, I think, a similarity to sort of delayed or partial recognition. But if you could talk a little bit more about Ives, and I think it belongs to him, the phrase that, you know, when there was some new wave of belated recognition, and he, by then no longer composing, said, you know, you're something to the extent that you're too late. Can you talk about this in some way, I think, rather tragic fate of Ives, and him not being recognized at the right time in the right place?
This feels like the biggest topic that we've addressed. It's so big, I don't know where to start, and it's so sad in some ways. Ives is a composer on the world stage of the highest stature. When I was, for 10 years, I ran something called Music Unwound, which was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I was working with orchestras all over the United States on festival programming on 4 topics. One of the topics was Charles Ives's America. And the repertoire included Ives' Second Symphony, completed in 1909. And it was, I must admit, surprising to me how little this symphony was played and known. Not known to conductors, not known to orchestras, not known to audiences, because it's an easy symphony to like. It ends with a triumphant peroration of Columbia, the gem of the ocean, which even today we still recognize. It pays tribute to the Civil War, to the fate of the slaves. It's a dandy symphony. It may be, you know, our iconic American symphony. It was not performed until 1951. It composed, we think he finished it in 1909. 51, Bernstein premiered it, and later in the same decade, he recorded it. That recording was noticed, and yet it was still not performed. There's no adequate reason for this. Maybe there's a stigma in play that Ives's music is difficult or challenging or not sufficiently attractive to audiences. So one of the games I play in my book, I think 2 of the hypotheticals that most excite me. What if Gershwin had lived to be 80? What if Mahler had discovered Ives? Mahler was the music director of the New York Philharmonic, and it seems pretty clear that he stumbled on Ives' Third Symphony. Ives' Second Symphony was sitting in a closet belonging to Walter Damrosch. Ives had sent the symphony to Walter Damrosch, not somebody likely to take an interest, and Damrosch apparently never looked at it. If, in fact, it had been Mahler's closet, Mahler would have taken an interest in Ives because they're very kindred in their use of the past and their use of the vernacular. It's not hard to understand that Mahler would have taken an interest. And suppose he had performed Ives' Second Symphony in 1910. It actually could have happened. It would have changed a lot of things. So the film I did on Ives, I think, is the strongest of the 6. And I do believe it is an irresistible act of advocacy. I think if people watch this film, they can't help but feel an obligation to promote the music of Ives. The piece that I most pay attention to is Three Places in New England, the first and third movements. The third movement, the Housatonic at Stockbridge, seems to me the most beautiful symphonic music ever composed by an American. And the first movement is difficult Ives. It's his Black March. It's responding to the famous sculpture of St. Gaudens on Boston Common of Colonel Shaw's Black Regiment in the Civil War. And we spend a lot of time looking at these pieces. I'm assisted by James Sinclair and Peter Burkholder, both of whom know more than I do about Ives. And the clip that I have, whenever you want to see it, is Peter Bogdanoff and Jim Sinclair helping us appreciate the Housatonic at Stockbridge. Certainly, there's music by Ives that needs to be contextualized in performance. I'm not saying that there should be a screen and stuff going on the screen while the music is playing. That's usually a terrible idea. But if you're going to present the Housatonic at Stockbridge, you should first have somebody sing the song, and you should explain to the audience some of what is articulated by Jim Sinclair in this clip about what Ives is doing. Because the notion is still virulent that Ives didn't know what he was doing, and that somehow he's a kind of hit and miss composer. And that's not true in the Housatonic at Stockbridge.
Well, let's see. Shall we see the short clip you selected?
Yeah, this is a short clip. Let's watch.
The Housatonic at Stockbridge is also an orchestral piece that followed his original ideas just after his honeymoon. He wanted to capture in more complex sound the real sound image of that event: early morning, a church choir practicing, mists, the feel and look of the river. How do you translate it into sound? He didn't have a lot of experience writing for orchestra or in hearing people play his music. He would get theater orchestras, small groups, to play particular ideas and experiments. But when it comes to a piece like this, it's an absolute triumph over inexperience to be producing such an amazing texture. The bottom sound is the depth of the river, the low strings, and then there are above that slightly more moving lines that represent the surface of the water, and above that a more magical mix of strings in multiple layers, each playing at a different speed and meandering through different kinds of pitches. It ends up being a sonic world that is unique and is admired by so many people when they hear it.
Well, we have to hear the whole piece, of course, but I think a number of people here know this. So tragically unrecognized hypothetical miss of Mahler not recognizing, and what do you find that did to Ives?
I just say something about the Housatonic at Stockbridge, Kirill. Just think of the greatest music you know evoking nature in the symphonic repertoire, whether it's Beethoven, Delius, Berlioz.
Well, my mind turns to Debussy.
Okay, fine. This is as good as that.
Yeah, no, I'm not arguing with you. Yeah.
I'm not saying that you're arguing with me, but it's not played. It's not known. It's not hard to appreciate. How is it possible that American orchestras and American audiences don't know this piece? There's no answer to this rhetorical question.
I was hoping you'd give me one, but you are giving so complex and multi-layered answer. But what happens? I mean, there's obviously this. I guess the other parallel, but for different reasons, is Sibelius with this so very long life after the creative output. Wouldn't say stops, but stops being released, and Ives lives such a long life, but no longer composing.
There are four guys: Sibelius, Elgar, Faya, Ives, all of whom, to some degree, I believe, stopped composing for the same reason, which was modernism. Chadwick, it's true, George Chadwick for sure, and many other, lesser composers. But these four huge figures are estranged from the aesthetic moment. Those are four, very, very interesting stories that really deserve to be told in the same breath. Somebody should look at those four composers as a group.
We're so in some way, if one moves, so we jump around as we should, but we are edging closer to Copeland, with whom the seminar began. And in your book, you have a subsection about Copeland and Mexico. So here's Copeland not turning to jazz, but turning to Mexico. Do you want to talk about that and what happens with that?
Yeah, I would like to talk about Silvestre Revueltas. Do you know this name?
Of course.
What music do you know by Revueltas?
From Revueltas, I remember my 1924 course at Manhattan School of Music, and whatever was played there. But you caught me because I can't name the
He's a
piece.
really great composer for orchestra. He's a guy, you hear a minute of his music, he's got his own sonic signature. It's based in the vernacular. It's based in the bandas, the village bandas and street cries of his youth. I know all of this from Roberto Kolb, who's the great Revueltas expert in the world today, and whose book on Revueltas will come out in the next year or two. Revueltas, like Gershwin, is a born populist. He's not.
I think the work that I remember is Sensamaya. This is the
Sensamaya is based on a poem by Guillen about capitalism and slaying a snake. He's the great political composer of the Western Hemisphere. He may be the only great political composer of concert music. He's a guy in our hemisphere. He can combine art and propaganda the way it sometimes could happen in the Soviet Union or in Weimar Germany.
Hans Eisler is a strong example of propaganda music.
Yes, we don't have a composer like that in the United States. The closest is Blitzstein, and Blitzstein is no Revueltas. Revueltas is, it's another one. This kind of thing drives me completely nuts. In these 6 films, I'm presenting music that's of the highest quality that's not known. Bernard Herrmann is such a composer. Lou Harrison's piano concerto, I think, is the most formidable concerto by any American. And when you get to Revueltas, it's just mind-boggling. When Esa-Pekka Salonen became music director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, he not only moved to Los Angeles, he attempted to curate the past. And he asked himself, is there American music that I can embrace? And he was not a candidate to embrace Copeland. And he found 2 composers. And I say bravo to his choice of Bernard Herrmann and Esa-Pekka Salonen. I consider Herrmann, who everybody knows is a movie composer, the single most underrated 20th century American composer. And I'm referencing his clarinet quintet, his radio plays like Whitman, I would love to hear a live performance of Moby Dick, his big cantata. And one of our post-classical ensemble CDs has the world premiere recording of his radio drama Whitman from 1942, which should be performed as a concert work. In the case of Revueltas, this is the other composer that Salonen found. He did an all Revueltas CD. I think he heard Revueltas as a Stravinsky kind of composer. You can also hear Revueltas as an Ives kind of composer. But above all, Revueltas is unlike anybody else. You can't really categorize him. And he has his own sound. And I must say, however gratuitous this may seem, that he is a victim of the modernists just as much as Gershwin, that Chavez was to Revueltas what Copeland was to Gershwin. And Chavez actually suppressed the music of Revueltas. It's all in my book. But I don't know how I got to this topic. Oh, yes, Copeland in Mexico. Revueltas, there's no describing what an imposing, what an original composer is Silvestre Revueltas, who died at a very early age in 1940.
speaking about Mexico, and the next question I have for you anyway, well, you talk about CIA in your book and about the Red and the Red Scare. But if we're on the topic of Mexico, and I'm not sure that's somebody you mentioned in your book, Conlan Nancaro. What is your impression of Conlan Nancaro, who obviously American plays jazz trumpet?
I have a very, very positive impression of Nancaro, and also of the versions of his player piano pieces that were created for chamber ensemble by a composer whose name I'm blanking on, with a Russian name. Do you know who I'm talking about? Probably there.
Not sure. This I'd have to look up, but I know the three studies that Tom Addis has arranged from player piano. He's arranged it for two. And it's, speaking about these kind of hypothetical moments, Tom sort of hypothetically blames Elliott Carter not introducing Nancaro's music to Igor Stravinsky, because Tom says, well, that would have been an incredibly staggering shot of inspiration, provocation for Stravinsky. And it seems Elliott Carter knew Nancaro's music, but seemed to keep quiet about it.
There's this trope of this self-invented American genius. Harrison is such a person. Ives is such a person. Melville is such a person. Whitman is such a person. Gershwin is such a person. Nancaro is such a person. Inventors.
And then, of course, Nancaro is in Mexico, and Copland's influence with Mexico. And then you talk about the CIA and the standard narrative, and the communists and the Reds. So this is coming back to also the opening clip. What is the CIA and the standard narrative as it pertains to our subject of music history?
This is my next book. It's called The Propaganda of Freedom, and it's about Nicholas Nabokov and the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Do you know the name Nicholas Nabokov?
Yes, of course.
And he composed, I guess his best known work would be the Don Quixote ballet he did for Balancing. So Nabokov was the music expert for the State Department and the White House and the CIA. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was covertly funded by the CIA, was America's Cold War propaganda arm abroad. And Nabokov, as you probably know, was very closely associated with Stravinsky.
There's, I think, that charming clip on YouTube where they're drinking whiskey or vodka together, whatever they're drinking, something they're drinking.
So this exercise was very much a Stravinsky propaganda exercise. That's the music that Nabokov was eager to promote. He's so unfamiliar with Ives that in a letter he misspells Ives' name Y-V-E-S. And certainly he had no interest in Mr. Gershwin. So he fits right into the standard narrative and the influence that it wielded, in this case, via American cultural diplomacy.
And what role do you find? What were the goals and aims here of this cultural diplomacy or covert propaganda sponsored by the CIA?
Cultural freedom was an attempt to influence artists and intellectuals on the left so that they wouldn't become communists. That was the idea. I mean, it's a topic unto itself. I don't know if you want to pursue it. We could go there.
Well, it is interesting, I guess. Tempting, being from the late Soviet Union, but obviously since we heard
the last thing that
testifying
was a festival in Paris in the early 50s. I think it was 53. An enormous amount of money from the CIA was poured into this festival. It included the Coven Opera doing Peter Grimes with Benjamin Britten conducting, Wozzeck from Berlin, the New York City Ballet. It was just vast. Four Saints in Three Acts by Virgil Thompson. And it was an attempt ostensibly to, this really is tangential, to make a case, which was Nabokov's calling card, that the arts, you'll love this, the arts can only flourish in free societies and only free artists can make great art. So Nabokov, an embittered exile from Russia, was of the opinion that Shostakovich was a lesser composer than Vittorio Rietti, a lesser composer than William Schumann. And it was his contention, which was adopted by the State Department, by the CIA, and by the White House, by John Kennedy, that only in free societies could there be free artists, and only free artists could create great art.
This is quite a
lot. A lot. I know. That's why I wrote the book, because it's just mind-boggling that this was an article of faith during the Cold War, and it was.
If one could say from, you know, all the problematic things with it and about it, but how far we've traveled from the belief in the meaning and strength of culture and its influence, that, you know, that the CIA was funding something related to classical music or modern art, not just classical music. I think we are not there anymore.
Absolutely. I think that's maybe the most important inference to make. The arts have so greatly diminished in importance, especially here in the United States, more than in Europe.
And so have to ask, as we sort of spread out into the wide open of not just American music history and some of its forgotten heroes, but the meaning of the arts and their relevance. One concrete thing you've suggested as far as programming and this initiative that you are developing with cultivation of the next generation of dramaturgs. What are some other things, in your opinion, that can be done, forgetting now for a second classical music, but classical music being included as one of the art forms? What can be done still without us sitting here and saying, oh, you know, it's all spilled milk?
You know, I have two different mindsets. One is depressed and fatalistic, and the other is kind of frantically optimistic, or at least constructive. And they coexist. I'm not sure how. The first thing I would say, Kirill, about America is that our experiment in laissez-faire support of the arts can now be declared a failure. And there's no way to move forward, in my opinion, without re-examining the role of government in the arts, and it's not happening. We have a president now, we have a White House. We don't have a culture ministry. We don't have anybody in Washington with any informed oversight of the state of the arts in the United States. This is different from any European country that you could name. One of the things I learned writing my book, The Propaganda of Freedom, which maybe will be out in about a year, is that the day John F. Kennedy died, an early edition of the New York Times announced that he would appoint Richard Goodwin his chief advisor on the arts, Dick Goodwin, and part of the Kennedy inner circle. And after the assassination, the story was killed, and of course, Goodwin was never appointed. What was Goodwin going to do? Well, first of all, Goodwin was a very, very formidable player. This could not have been window dressing. And his mandate, first of all, was to have some kind of an informed overview of how the government and the arts interact, because there are hidden subsidies of the arts in the way that the United States spends money. At that moment, there was not yet a National Endowment for the Arts or a Kennedy Center or a National Endowment for the Humanities. And Kennedy himself, because he was a Cold War ideologue, did not favor arts subsidies of the kind that were commonplace and remain commonplace abroad. But something would have happened had the Goodwin appointment taken place. And I think one could reasonably predict that if Goodwin had been appointed at this moment in time, we would know something about the relationship between government and the arts and be more disposed to consider that an important relationship. When the pandemic hit, I've written about this, it's an excruciating topic. You were probably in Berlin, where there was an immediate cry to save our cultural institutions. And even in the UK, where it was delayed, you had people like Nick Kenyon and Simon Rattle being heard, and Boris Johnson saying, we can't abandon our artists. There is nothing like that in the United States. It's appalling, it's depressing. It's enough to make you weep. It's not talked about. And I have many things to say about this that are very unpopular and even dangerous to say. I think that the foundation community, the charitable foundations in the United States, who traditionally supported the arts and are now not doing so because of their reprioritizing social justice, or even perceiving arts institutions fundamentally as instruments for social justice. I'm all for social justice, and I'm as upset about the murder of George Floyd as anyone. But I'm not in favor of abandoning the arts and of support for the arts and of financial support for the arts. In the United States right now, it's urgent that the United States government support the arts.
Because you think the age of foundational and private sponsorship is...
The private sponsors that we once had, whether it's Mellon, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Higginson, this is not the world of Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. They're not going to be supporting. I don't see any evidence that private wealth is as disposed to support the arts as when Frick was collecting art. And as I say, the foundations are now looking elsewhere. So there's a huge deficit.
But why do you think that changed? I mean, it's just very obviously really unfair to ask you this and to expect an answer. It's obviously very complex. But why do you think the billionaires of yesterdecades were much more attuned to supporting the arts than it would seem? Some of the new...
There are a couple of books by the sociologist Robert Putnam about social capital that are very well known. One is called Bowling Alone, in which he talks about the lack of social capital, which is bonding community. In the United States today, people bowl alone, what to do about it. And by and large, the arts are not part of his purview. We have very, very defective memories as Americans. So we don't remember how important the arts were in the period that I've been talking about before World War I. It's not just that people of great wealth were great cultural philanthropists. Artworks furnished social capital. I was talking about this the other day with Alan Guelzo, a historian who cares about culture. His new book is on Robert E. Lee. You cannot talk about the Gilded Age, which is the period in the late 19th century, without talking about the New World Symphony, Wagnerism, the Song of Hiawatha, the paintings of Frederick Church, which are from an earlier period. But these artworks were fundamental in informing Americans who they were. They were mirrors. They were part of American identity. Wagnerism is a huge mirror. It's hard to believe this or to remember it, but I'm talking about a decade in the 1880s, 1890s, when you pick up a magazine and it might be about Wagner at Bayreuth. I mean, Wagnerism was part of general intellectual discourse, and the notion of Wagner as a source of uplift, as a meliorist, was pervasive. Americans had their own Wagner and their own experience of Wagner. My point is not about Wagner, it's about the role of culture, the role of the arts was enormous in the United States in the late 19th century, and the philanthropists of that period were part of that world, which no longer exists.
So this is the pessimist in you, and the frantic optimist.
Yeah, I'm a pessimist and a frantic optimist. Yeah,
So
I do frame
what does the frantic optimist say still can be done?
I frame my book as a call for action, and I have colleagues, not very many of them, who are kindred. Maybe I shouldn't name them, or they might get in trouble. But there are certainly prominent music educators in the United States right now. They're a minority who feel exactly as I do, and I'm not going to give up on the prioritization of cultivating an American past. It's not really a top priority right now for the orchestras, but it has to become one. However esoteric or arcane it may seem at first glance, if they don't cultivate an American cultural past, they will not be part of an American cultural future. And this is doable. I'm talking about programming the Dawson Symphony and contextualizing it. I'm talking about paying proper attention to Charles Ives and his forebears and the world in which he existed. This is all doable. Jason does it at Brevard. Jason may still be on this call. Jason may even want to open his mouth, but he curates.
He's still here, and I offered him to speak if he'd like, but he's definitely still here.
He curates the American past.
But this is an interesting, general question, obviously not only related to America, and I would love to hear your answer. Why do you think this connection to the past is important, and the awareness of our past? I mean, I agree with it, and I agree with it sort of instinctively and biologically, and there are many pasts that we have culturally that I think are very important to be connected to. But if somebody insolently comes and says, well, why is it important to cultivate the American past, and why will a lack of cultivating it exclude us from being in the American future? What's your answer to that?
It's hard to answer a question, the answer which seems so self-evident. What did Faulkner say? The past isn't even past. You know, Faulkner, maybe our greatest novelist, is not only steeped in the past, he's all about the past. And if you have any affinity for Faulkner, you absorb the notion that there is nothing without the past. There's no present, there's no future without the past. The past is an anchor. How can we even have an identity? This is one of the most discouraging things about the present moment, that with the social media moment, which tends to expunge the past, presentism, there's even a word for it. I don't see how a culture, a nation, an individual can flourish without a sense of the past. And as I said, when something is so self-evident, it's kind of hard to say anything more than that.
Yes, no, I'm definitely with you, but you know these questions do come, and they come very insolently.
At the front of my book, it says, I have something from George Santayana. The American mind does not oppose tradition, it forgets it.
Yes, this is very, very poignant. Perhaps it's time also to ask our participants here, and we have some very distinguished ones, if they would like to ask some questions or contradict you or to comment or any of the above. But there was a question earlier that I held off on from Robert Goller, who says, how would you reposition Edward MacDowell, often considered the first American composer who trained in Europe, but also wrote pieces like the Indian Suite? So I'll lead off with that question that was posed earlier.
Thanks for that interesting question. You know, Virgil Thompson, when it became obvious that he had to say something about Ives, this is an exercise in cognitive dissonance, because Thompson insisted that there was no important American music before 1910, wound up writing, not that long ago, I think it was maybe the 70s, that MacDowell would be more remembered than Ives, which is, you know, what can I say, risible. I don't feel an affinity personally for MacDowell. There was a debate in the 80s and 90s on the question, the interesting question, should American composers be consciously American? Will their music acquire an American identity on its own, or do they have to make a special conscious effort? And Crabill is at the center of this. And in the course of this debate, he changed his mind and came to the second position, that they should be consciously American. So MacDowell is somebody who was at times consciously American and at times not, but he distanced himself from Dvorak's project. He wrote a piece called the Indian Suite. Maybe, I suppose it's his most ambitious exercise in, quote, Indianist music. And he said that the slow movement of that suite was, in his opinion, his highest achievement as a composer. And if you listen to that slow movement, which is a dirge, it's very obviously indebted to Siegfried's funeral music from Götterdämmerung. And I think that's the nub for me. I feel the presence of Europe hovering over the music of Edward MacDowell, whether it's Grieg influencing his piano miniatures or Wagner influencing his Indian dirge. I'm more attracted to composers like Ives and Gershwin and Harrison, who seem to me less indebted to European models. And I do believe that ultimately they are the composers who more greatly matter. There are people who feel differently. Douglas Bomberger, a colleague of mine, has a book on MacDowell, and he has a much more enthusiastic take on MacDowell than I do.
There's a good question from Paul Bogosian, a philosopher and a great connoisseur of music, and somebody that's given a talk in this forum. Paul writes, the question is why it has to be a national past. In a time of cosmopolitanism, with classical music appealing to audiences around the world, why does it need a specifically American past? I can certainly sympathize with the claim, but it's not, I think, totally self-evident.
I'm not espousing that composers today do that. I think today is a global moment. And for me, the harbinger in American classical music was Lou Harrison, who practiced a fusion of East and West. And even though I find, quote, American resonance in his piano concerto, it's greatly indebted to Indonesian gamelan and also Indian music. I think I'm a big fan of Lou Harrison. And if he's an American composer of consequence, it's not because he's drawn upon this usable past that I've been talking about. I think in order to situate ourselves and feel rooted and anchored, I'm talking about institutions of performance, I'm talking, I guess, mainly about orchestras. Even if we move forward into music by Lou Harrison or Thomas Addis or whomever, I think there has to be an anchor. I think there has to be a past. I think there do have to be roots which we have peculiarly failed to cultivate in the case of American classical music. The same thing within the Metropolitan Museum isn't, going to prioritize this. Well, they might because of the particular moment that we're in, but the world of contemporary American art isn't rooted in Frederick Church and Winslow Homer, but I think it's absolutely essential that we know about Frederick Church and Winslow Homer. I don't know if that's an adequate response to your interesting question.
No, it's well, and I think I agree with you that especially when you're referring to institutions in the United States, that we somehow have to understand globally and also locally where our pasts lie. Judith Neville comments and questions, very insightful discussion. Thank you. Do you think Americans tend to forget their past because they're ashamed of so much of it? Well, I guess then there's also a question of whether you think that Americans are so ashamed of so much.
I think that, we're all experiencing shame. I don't see how we can personally get past what we did to Native Americans and African Americans. And this shame is now pervasive and it's warranted. But it is rather new. I don't think it was a factor certainly in the Gilded Age or in the modernist decades. I don't think that shame comes into play. And that's despite the fact that in New York in the 1890s, people are very aware of the extinction of the Indian. I mean, people in the 1890s in New York believed that the Indian would grow extinct. And that is partly what was driving people like Crabill or women like Alice Fletcher and Natalie Curtis, who were eagerly collecting specimens of Native American music. That surely shame was a component of that. And Farwell, who I talked about before, he felt a lot of shame. But it was actually an incentive in this case for looking at the past rather than a disincentive. It'd be too bad if the shame we feel now, I think even now, the shame that I feel as an American makes me want to know the past, not to ignore it.
Yes, absolutely. Reckoning with our past is perhaps the only way forward. If there are no more questions, and questions are still very welcome, I thought that as a musical way of circling back about to where we started, that I would let Joe pick a movement of the American suite of Dvorak, and we'd lead off with that and go contemplate all the information that Joe has given us while pre-ordering his book. Shall we play a movement?
Do you have a recording at hand?
Yes, I have a recording at hand, and I do remember that you were well impressed by the recording of my friend James Gaffigan conducting the Lucerne Orchestra. So
the third move of the American Suite has three themes. The first is like a minstrel dance. The second is like a plantation song. And the elegiac third theme in C-sharp minor is a specimen of his Indianist genre, which is not based in Indian music, but it evokes for him the world of the Native American. And you'll find that these themes interact and come back in very beautiful ways.
This is the Moderato alla Polacca.
That's
or the yeah.
That's it.
So here we have that. So, Joe, on this beautiful note of a piece by Dvorak that you champion, and I know that I intend to fulfill my promise to learn the Dvorak humorests, and I think to play the one in F after the Gershwin concerto in F will be very fitting. But for now, I wanted to thank you for sharing your time and your tremendous insight into past and present American and global, and it's always a thrill for me to hear you speak about anything. I learned very much. I think we've learned a lot today, and I think we're all looking forward to the book and the book after that, and I'm sure we'll find the next topic and hope that you'll agree to return and to speak about that.
Well, be sure to let me know when you acquire that F major humoresque. And also, if you do the Busoni Indian fantasy, it would make me very happy.
That is definitely on my wish list of things to do, the Busoni Indianische Fantasie. So for now, I want to say thank you to everyone that was listening and participating and for your questions. And next week, there'll be another seminar. But for now, thank you, Joe. Have a good evening or good day, and more soon.
Thanks again, Kirill. Bye-bye.